These are Nebraska corn farmers. They work in acres, not hours, harvesting the energy and climate solutions the world needs. We are proud to stand with you.
The success of tomorrow's soy industry depends on the actions we take today. The future is here, and the time to move is now.
Market Journal Television for Agricultural Business Decisions is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources in partnership with the Nebraska Rural Radio Association. Promotional support provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine and partial funding provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board and the Nebraska Corn Board.
Hello everyone, I'm Alex McAviga. Thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. Bryce Doeschot is out on assignment this week. Coming up for you on this week's program, we'll explore the new Agricultural Sustainability Index tool created right here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Speaking of the university, the research conducted here is a valuable asset to the state's producers, but sometimes that can be a springboard into new business ventures. We'll see how research has led to the creation of a new company called Dryland Genetics, and as always, we'll get you the latest on the markets and weather. But we'll begin here today. For this week's In the Field update, we go to Southwest Nebraska. Market Journal host Bryce Doeschot was on the road and caught up with a producer in the area on Thursday.
Yeah, that's right, Alex. We are in Southwest Nebraska, very near the Colorado-Nebraska line, west of Imperial, as we're catching up now with Kurt Bernhardt. You guys are picking corn right now. Let's set the conversation up, though. Tell me about the farming operation.
Well, I farm with my family, my brother and I, and then my wife and my children, mostly corn and then some irrigated wheat and pinto beans and soybeans, and then this year we're trying some irrigated milo.
Okay, harvesting corn behind us, as I mentioned today. How are things going with the harvest front?
It's going good. It's going quick this year just because we've had such dry weather, plus we had a major hailstorm July 19th, and it don't really look like it's hailed that bad, but it did a lot of ear and stalk damage, and so it's reduced our yields. We did have some fields north here that were completely totaled out from that storm, which upwards of, we've heard of 100 pivots were probably totally destroyed during that storm.
What percent would you put yourself complete at this point for corn harvest?
We're probably 2/3.
Okay. How about for the other crops you mentioned?
Yeah, we're all done with everything else. We finished our soybeans, which we only had one circle left after the rest of them got hailed out, and we finished them here about 10 days ago, and then our pinto beans we did at the 1st of September, and of course the wheat was done in July.
Tell me a bit about the pinto bean, what that process is like. Obviously not something we talk about often here on the show.
Right. You know, they're really not similar to a soybean. You plant them, I mean, with a row crop planter just like you do your corn and stuff, but they grow more closer to the ground, and they're an edible food item, you know, that you use in like soups and chilies and of course refried beans. That's where pinto beans go into that. Yeah. But they're an interesting crop.
Talk about your market for the various crops that you're growing. Do you have to truck them a ways, or you find some markets locally for those?
Well, our corn, the stuff we put in our own grain band setup, a lot of that goes to Sterling, Colorado, to the ethanol plant or feedlots, or we got feedlots. We got neighbors around here that take it too. And then the soybeans, we mostly go to the elevator, and then they distributed them from there. And then our pinto beans, we deal with a local contractor in Imperial, Trinidad, Benham. And then our wheat, we raise hard white winter wheat, and that goes to Frenchman Valley Co-op, and it's signed on with Ardent Mills. And then they take it and do whatever they do with it.
Yep. Well, the story of the fall has been how dry things have been. Seems like across the state, it doesn't really matter where you're at. Things are getting drier and drier as the weeks progress. Not a lot of rain for your area since what, August or so?
Yeah, I think the last good rain we had was probably about that third week in August, which August was really mild temperature-wise, and we had rain, which is really unusual for us. But then September, it's just been really warm and dry again.
That said, you guys are planting some wheat right now, correct?
Yeah, we're finishing up with some wheat, and yeah, hopefully try to just work that into a rotation to get some fields rotated out of corn.
I have to imagine pivots are going to be going on that wheat to make sure it merges out of the ground before wintertime.
Yeah, and usually you don't have to run your pivots this much in the fall, but where it's so dry, you know, everybody's irrigating their wheat just because it's just using it right now too.
A big thanks to Bryce for bringing us that in the field update. We'll have more updates from other local producers as harvest continues throughout the fall. Well, moving on, you may recall a couple of weeks ago, we gave you a behind-the-scenes look at UNL's Havelock Farms. UNL's Dean of Agricultural Research, McLean, and UNL geneticist James Schnable shared how locations like Havelock Farms are pushing the boundaries of agriculture and how much of the work on these test plots led to the creation of a new company called Dryland Genetics.
Now, I know you also work a lot in the entrepreneurial space and that you've developed companies, and these companies really are geared also to help productivity, to help efficiency, and again, to help the bottom line of our producers. And you know, here we're kind of in late summer, early fall, so it's drier, the corn's dry, and, you know, it's getting ready to be harvested. But you also have a company called Dryland Genetics that I think is providing new opportunities for Nebraska farmers. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So if you think about productivity, there are probably three big things that are limiting the total amount of grain produced in Nebraska. One is access to nitrogen, one is access to water, and one is access to land. Now, I cannot make more land. I don't think there's going to be any company that can do that. But if we look at water, here in eastern Nebraska, we're more limited by land than by water. We can typically irrigate or we grow rain-fed on all the land that we have access to. In western Nebraska and throughout the high plains, we have lots of land that just doesn't have enough water to successfully grow dryland corn from year to year. In Dryland Genetics, we identified another grain, proso millet, which actually was already being grown in the Nebraska Panhandle and Colorado, that can be used for all the same things as corn. You can use it for ethanol production, you can use it for animal feed, or it can go into human health, human food consumption. But it produces about twice as much grain per unit water. The yield per acre is much lower, but if you're out in western Nebraska, eastern Colorado, there's actually a lot of land, and it's much lower value land because they're limited by water, not by land. So being able to produce more grain per drop is more important than more bushels per acre. The downside of this crop is that it really had not benefited from the same investments in breeding for higher yield, higher agronomics as corn, soybeans, wheat, things like that. We were able to come in and use the advanced breeding technologies originally developed to increase the yield of corn. The yield of corn has gone up something like 6 to 8 times over the last 100 years, and very rapidly increased the productivity of proso millet by between 20 and 40%. So now farmers in the Nebraska Panhandle and Colorado are seeing more grain from the same land because of the breeding that we have done within the company.
So I'm really interested to learn more about proso millet and where it can be grown and where it can be a crop. Is this a crop for just western Nebraska, or it could be expanded for the entire state?
So that's a really good question. Right now, it's primarily grown in western Nebraska and then neighboring states out there on the high plains. But we're seeing an increasing amount of interest and adoption, even here in eastern Nebraska and even out into Iowa. The thing that growers really like about it is proso millet is planted after the corn and the beans, and it's harvested before them. So this allows them to be more efficient with their labor and their equipment. With the same number of people, with the same number of combines, they can plant and harvest more acres, as well as having that third crop. It helps with rotations, being able to break up weed and pest cycles. And frankly, when you talk to growers, they're just excited to see this new crop in a field. We've had test plots, and people will just stop and ask, what is this? You know, where do I sell it? Where do I buy it?
So it sounds like this is another opportunity for a source of revenue for producers. And it also comes back to that carbon index. Could you just really focus in on that carbon index and how this influences soil health?
Yes, absolutely. So there are a lot of approaches out there people talk about that can, increase sustainability, reduce carbon index. Farmers are very busy people. If we want them to adopt new practices, it needs to work with the bottom line. And so things like getting another crop that you can actually sell, that you can actually get paid twice a year instead of once a year, that is a great way to increase sustainability in a way that is a win for everyone, rather than things that are just a lot of extra work without a clear payoff in the end.
Understanding, again, those inputs, the cost of the input, and then what the expected revenue is and how that can help the bottom line for our producers.
Yes.
So again, another success story where we're able to use genetic approaches and genetic improvement for higher crop yield. And I really like about Dryland Genetics is some of the what are the top 5 reasons, that it can help you? And one of those is more crop for drop,
Yes.
where you can get more out of, as you're saying, with limited resources and limited input. Do you see this as an opportunity more for a global scale production as well?
Absolutely. So proso millet was a crop that was originally domesticated in northern China. It's still consumed throughout East Asia, through India, in large parts of Europe. And I think that the advances that we're making here in the U.S. have the ability to impact all of those regions. In the short term, we're seeing a growing amount of demand for export of proso millet to many of these regions where the crop is not being grown as much, but it's still an important cultural part of the diet. In the longer term, I think the same approaches that we're using for breeding to increase yields here in Nebraska could be used to also increase yields, develop new seed varieties around the globe.
So this is not only something new for Nebraska, but this also opens up the supply chain and potentially opens up new markets for Nebraska producers.
Absolutely, and I think that's going to be a very important thing. It's very hard to go from 0 acres to 500 acres. Proso millet has already grown on about 500,000 acres here in the U.S. We have the supply chains. It's being sold to elevators. It's being moved in rail cars. And once you have that level of scale, it's possible very rapidly to scale to much, much larger scales of production as long as the demand is there. And we see that coming from the ethanol industry. We see that coming from the feeding industry here in the U.S. And we see this growing export market.
Excellent. Well, I think we all here at the University of Nebraska appreciate your entrepreneurial spirit and your innovative approach to helping push basically the limits of productivity and opportunities for Nebraska producers. What other things do you see in the future? It could be corn and soybeans and other opportunities, though, that we have for Nebraska in agriculture, especially in row crop agriculture.
Yeah. So I think one of the real pressures, everyone is conscious of this in Nebraska, is we need to be continuing to increase the amount of crops we're producing from the same amount of land. Mm-hmm. I mentioned one thing we can do out west is we can deploy crops that produce more grain per unit water. Here in the east, one of the things that we're going to see more of going forward is winter cropping. So not just cover crops, but cash crops you can plant after your corn or beans and harvest before you put your next crop in the ground. Something like winter wheat. One of my colleagues, Deepak Santra, is working on this with winter peas. Ed Cahoon, another professor in the department, is developing camelina, but allowing farmers to actually get 2 crops off of their land and make sure that that land isn't sitting idle. They're actually getting paid twice a year, and we're getting more.
And thanks to Derek and James for allowing us to document that conversation. If you'd like to learn more about proso millet and Dryland Genetics, you can do so by visiting their website, drylandgenetics.com. Moving along now, it's time to turn our attention over to the markets. Earlier this week, Market Journal host Bryce Doeschot sat down with TREDAS Risk Management consultant and commodity broker Doug Simon to get his take on the markets and what producers should keep an eye on. Here's their conversation from Thursday morning.
Let's talk about crop progress. We see the USDA reports coming out weekly. Pace is pretty impressive at the rate farmers getting the crop out.
It's been very dry, and so the crops have dried down very quickly, both on corn and beans. Last couple of years, it's been more staggered because of higher moisture corn and beans, but beans are coming in at 8% moisture now, and corn somewhere between 12 and 15, so it dried down. Should be around 70% completed, I think, by the weekend on soybeans nationally, and probably more toward 50% on the corn. So we're definitely moving ahead very quickly right now.
Let's dive into the corn market. Obviously, I want to mention we do have a USDA report coming out on Friday after you and I are having this conversation. With that report, though, expecting USDA to confirm what we're expecting, record corn production in the U.S. How's that going to impact the corn market moving forward?
Well, we've had the yields last month, or the average trade guess, is just fractionally lower both on the corn and the beans. And those big yields, we've been talking about that for quite a while. They weren't quite that high last January, but it's come to fruition that we're going to have those bigger crops on both the corn and the beans, and so it's left us in a much lower price parameter. But we put some lows in back in August, in that 385 level on the Dees corn, and the Novi beans are down at 1055, and the funds were massive shorts, similar to what they were back in February. So we've had that short covering. We've actually got more toward neutral on the beans and the corn. They're short maybe 30,000 contracts now on the beans, and only 60,000 contracts on the corn. So they've flipped out of that big short, and that's why we've had that rally, and part because of dry weather, part because of the political environment right now, talking about with the elections, whether we're going to have trade war with China or not, and so that's seemed to moved, to the back burner and maybe trying to see if we could enforce that and have China buy more beans. So that's given us a rally in here, which has been good. And it also had been pretty dry in Brazil, and that's all give us a nice rally.
Back on the corn side, saw a number come out on ethanol production up more than 2.5% year over year. Just kind of a reminder, I suppose, how important ethanol is for corn moving forward.
Well, if we raise around 15 billion, there's a little over 5 billion of that goes to ethanol, which is about a third of the corn. We feed around almost not quite 6 billion of for feeding. But yeah, it's a big deal to us now. The export side of it is actually improving this year relative to where it was last year. The expectations this summer, we exceeded those, and so it actually pulled down our incoming stocks into this crop year because of decent exports and also the cattle feeding side of it. We don't have as many cattle that we're feeding, but the carcass weights are huge, and we've been feeding a lot more corn per animal, and that's been positive as well.
On the soybean side of things, as you referenced, kind of seeing after a sell-off a bit of support here. Where do you see the soybean market moving going forward?
Well, that's a good question. With the rains coming in with South America, it's going to put a little pressure on us. We got up to that 1070 level for a recent high, and we're back toward 1020, so we're about 50 cents off that recent high. But if that rain really materializes, and there's some showing up down there, and the forecast this morning on Thursday are even better rains than what they were yesterday, so that we're going to probably try to put some pressure on soybeans. But the big picture is that the world stocks of beans and the U.S. stocks of beans are going to be big, and that's a heavier balance sheet than what the corn is. And the beans have more pressure on them. It's going to be hard to be able to let those move a lot higher right now.
We opened up this conversation talking about harvest progress. What's your sense when it comes to where corn and soybeans in particular are ending up? A lot of on-farm storage, or people choosing to haul to an end user or perhaps to the local cooperative?
Well, there's a lot of beans, I think we're moving off the combine just because the basis levels were pretty decent, and people tend to move beans more before they do on corn. And there was more relative carry in the corn market. I think people were trying to store a little bit more corn. There's some areas they've got the new Norfolk soybean crush plant, and people were talking about putting them in more bags and trying to store more beans in some new areas up there that had typically moved into town. So, but it's been a pretty fast-paced harvest here, and early basis levels are pretty decent on corn and beans, and they've slipped a little bit here, especially because it's been so dry in the eastern corn belt and water flowing into the Mississippi's low, and the basis levels over there have dropped off because of the fact that the freight rates are a lot higher on the barges, and because there's decent crop in eastern Iowa and Missouri.
Well, of course, we're talking about the near term here, 2024 crop, but you've looked ahead in 2025. Tell me what you found.
Well, you're looking at prices at just over $4.50. We were close to $4.60 this last week, and you look at in the 1060s on Novi 25 beans, and that corn to bean ratio is about 2.3. So probably going to favor a little more corn planting next year and maybe a few more corn acres. So if you're looking at 455 D25 corn, you got to be looking at your break evens and probably taking a swing at that. I mean, last year started on the 2024 crop, in this time frame when people are locking in different inputs on, fertilizers and selling an equal revenue component of what you're spending on those inputs and trying to keep that in balance. I think that's an important thing to look at, but look at, making those incremental sales. Seasonally, we do put in some lows this year. We've had a counter seasonal rally with the recent strength in those funds getting out, but when you look at it historically, you tend to have more strength into March on corn, all the way out into May from a seasonal track record. But this counter seasonal rally we've had has been a good place to price your 24 crop and then also get started on the 25 crop. And you can do that different ways, either using some put options underneath the soybean crop, the corn, probably just go out and get that hedge. Because you think about selling corn here today at $4.54, if we've got 30 odd cents of carry out to July, you could be somewhere $4.50 to $4.80 on those hedges or future, type positions, which is still going to be a pretty good price if we have a couple more million acres of corn next year.
Thanks to Doug for taking time out of his schedule to join us here in studio. If you have any questions for our future analysts, just feel free to email us or get in touch on social media. We'll be sure to pass those questions along. Trevor Pardee is a University of Nebraska sophomore. He travels to different events and participates in learning experiences to represent the swine industry as part of the Nebraska Pork Ambassador Program. But he's also building a swine operation of his own, starting out quite simply with 3 little pigs. You can read all about Party in the October issue of Nebraska Farmer. It's that time of the show to get our weekly updates on the weather with Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Eric Hunt standing by. Eric's still pretty dry around the state, but we are getting some cooler weather. How are things looking in the week ahead?
Thanks, Alice. Definitely see some frost on the pumpkin in the crystal ball for most of us in the state early this next week. Let's start by reviewing, though, how dry we were in the month of September. So a good portion of the state of Nebraska was certainly in the driest 10th percentile, if not the driest on record. We were a good company, though. A lot of Iowa, Minnesota, northern Wisconsin, and the UP of Michigan also had one of their driest Septembers on record. We've also been quite warm here across the state most of the last several weeks, including last Saturday, particularly across southeastern Nebraska, where we had some all-time record heat with a couple of spots hitting 100 degrees for the first time ever in the month of October. Again, we now have about 75% of the state in drought. Roughly a third of the state is in severe drought, including portions of all of 46 counties in the state. We now actually have a slither of the extreme drought into portions of Sioux County. Again, if we don't get some precipitation soon, we're going to see continued degradation, particularly across portions of western Nebraska, where we maybe haven't had as much of that just yet. Soil moisture across the state and across the region continues to be abysmal, with soil moisture generally below the 5th percentile across a very large portion this part of the country. Again, this is probably just about as bad, if not worse, in some cases we were even in 2012. So again, we really need some moisture back in this region soon to put down the wildfire risk that we've been having lately. Again, rangelands continue to be very, very poor across a lot of the high plains region, and they definitely have degraded a good bit here in the last month or so across portions of the sandhills, according to some vegetation index data. For the week ahead, we are going to see a trough move in the upper Midwest early this weekend that will drive a cold front through the state on Saturday night, and we will see noticeably cooler temperatures statewide on Sunday. Not significantly cool for this time of year, but certainly a bit cooler than what we have been. And with that, we're going to see a good chance of freezing temperatures across the western and central portion of the state on Monday morning, and I think a pretty good chance of everybody being below freezing, at least for a period of time on Tuesday morning. So we are likely going to see an end to our growing season for 2024 by early this next week. Temperatures will warm back up pretty quickly, though, by middle of the week as we go back to upper-level ridging in this region. And we are probably going to see temperatures getting back well into the 70s. I'm going to probably guess it will be most of us will probably see at least 1 or 2 days in the 80s by the end of this next week. There is some good news, though, and that is by late next week, we actually are going to see there is some signal for troughing getting into the southwestern United States. And with high pressure off the East Coast, that would actually set us up nicely for some return flow from the Gulf. Depending on how much energy this thing has, and again, this is still a ways out, so I got to see this to believe it, but this is a first decent signal for precipitation I've seen in this region for almost about a month. And again, I think it's too early to get real excited about amounts, but if this were to come to fruition, we could actually have widespread 1 to 2 inch rainfalls across a good portion of Nebraska and a wider portion of the region. So this would be real meaningful drought relief for a lot of the central U.S. if this comes to fruition. Now again, this is still a week out. I don't anticipate anybody getting any precipitation anywhere in the state until at least next Friday, so I think we still have at least another 5 to 6 days ahead of us for a harvest window without any interruptions from precipitation. The CPC is not necessarily in agreement with that rainfall yet, though, so again, just maybe don't get your hopes up too high for that rain just yet. We are expected to remain pretty warm across the state, probably through the later portion of October. Soil temperatures mostly in the 60s across the state. Highs range from 100 to 62. We had a low of 18. Congratulations to whoever this is in Omaha for having the only precipitation in the state the last 2 weeks. Thanks, and back to you, Alex.
All right, we'll see what happens this week. Thanks, Eric. Finally, today, as consumers become more interested in the environmental footprint of goods and services, farmers, processors, and others in the ag industry are looking for ways to understand the environmental impact of agriculture and to reduce that impact when possible. There's a new tool from the University of Nebraska that aims to help producers do just that. I recently visited with Elliot Dennis. He's an associate professor of agricultural economics at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and he highlighted this new tool. Well, we're learning more about the Sustainability Index. So just 30,000 foot perspective, what is that?
Yeah, it's a program that we're developing at UNL in conjunction with USDA to essentially try to quantify some of the agricultural practices and environmental practices that are happening in ag production. So we can think about things like trying to quantify something like carbon use, water use, energy use, and different animal welfare practices, and trying to put that all together in an index that potentially consumers are willing to pay for.
So from the consumer perspective, what does that look like? How do they use it?
Yeah, so for consumers, we've known for a long time that they've been willing to pay for different practices. For instance, like cage-free, they've been willing to pay for premiums for that. Even things like airlines. When you buy an airline ticket now, a lot of times you can choose flights depending upon their carbon emissions. So we know consumers are willing to pay for that. Now in the ag industry, we haven't had an ability to kind of transfer some of the stuff that we're already doing that's good and some things that we can improve on to the consumer. And so this index essentially creates that verification process, quantification of it, that then the consumers can see what it is, how it's produced, and then pay for that product.
Okay, the other side of it is the producers. What's their involvement in the sustainability index?
Yeah, so from the beginning of this, we've involved producers to try to actually quantify and verify the practices that we're thinking of. So going and looking at crop yield production, looking at different, fertilizer applications on the cattle side, looking at things like manure use, things like what they're feeding. And so during this process, we've actually engaged producers to say, okay, this is kind of how we're quantifying it, and this is kind of how we think it kind of rolls up into this kind of larger index. And so from that beginning, and with the end potential to say, okay, if we're doing good practices, how can we potentially boost profitability for producers for practices that they're already doing? And this quantification is really that preliminary step to anything that we might think of like carbon credits. Without quantification, we can't sell, things like carbon credits throughout the market.
Okay, you touched on it a little bit, but the end goal, what does that look like?
Yeah, the end goal is to really provide a way that producers can get paid for practices that consumers are, willing to pay for. And so there's been a lot of this discussion about, consumers and, what's the ag industry doing for, as far as sustainability. This index essentially quantifies that and allows consumers to put their money where their mouth is.
Well, we know the landscape of consumers and producers evolves rapidly. How do you see this evolving over time?
Yeah, so with any index, it constantly evolves and adapts. And so one of the things that we really pride ourselves at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln is continuing to do research in this realm. And so things that we talk about, the Feedlot Innovation Center and different feeding trials, we're actually able to take information from that, apply it directly to the index, and really get a most up-to-date index that reflects current science.
Awesome. Appreciate the insight. What else is important to mention as we round out our conversation?
Yeah, so this index is being validated this fall. We hope to have it up and running for producers to participate and use in this coming spring. If you're interested, just contact myself or other collaborators, and we'd be happy to tell you more.
A big thanks to Elliot for taking time to explain this new tool, and of course, we'll keep you updated on further developments. That is going to do it for this week's show. If you missed a story, be sure to like and subscribe to the Market Journal YouTube channel and give us a follow on social media to join in on the conversation. I hope to see you right back here next week. Until then, I'm Alex Makovica wishing you a safe harvest. Thanks for joining us.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.